Howdy everyone, and today I'm testing out yet another really interesting new Sigma lens, the 24-35mm f2 Art, which has the honour of being the widest aperture zoom lens made for full-frame cameras. Although admittedly 24-35mm is not much of a zoom. You're looking at a very wide to medium wide angle zoom range here. Sigma themselves market it as being 3 prime lenses in one, covering you for a fast 24, 28 and 35mm lens. And that impressive maximum aperture of f2 means that the lens lets in plenty of light and it can give you some nicely out of focus backgrounds. I can immediately envisage this lens being very useful for wedding photography. And at a cost of about £700 or around $1,000, this is probably a lens intended for professionals. If you own an APS-C camera rather than full frame, then there's no point in considering this lens, as Sigma's 18-35mm f1.8 Art lens will let in even more light for you and offers a better zoom range. But for full frame owners who are wide angle photography enthusiasts like me, and who really like to use fast lenses, the Sigma 24-35mm f2 is uniquely interesting. So let's take a closer look. This lens is big and weighs about 1 kilo, so it hardly rivals its prime lens competitors for portability. However, like Sigma's other new lenses, it feels like a precision-engineered luxury item, very solid indeed. The lens's rubberized zoom ring works incredibly smoothly with just the right amount of resistance and damping. The focus ring is much the same, very precise, and you can turn it at any time, whether or not the lens is set to auto or manual focus. There are no hard stops at either end though. The lens's autofocus system is quiet, but only averagely fast. During my testing, I found the lens's autofocus accuracy to be a bit disappointing. Especially at f2, the autofocus would slightly miss quite often. Not in a terribly bad way, but just enough to rob you of a little bit of sharpness. This lens does not feature image stabilization, so those doing handheld video work might prefer the Canon 35mm f2 IS-USM instead, or one of Tamron's cool new SP lenses. So overall, the lens has fantastic build quality, but its hefty size and weight might put some people off, and I was hoping for slightly more consistent autofocus. Okay, let's take a look at picture quality now. I've recently moved somewhere new, a long way from where I used to test camera lenses. So I've come up with a special test chart, which is a bit more clinical than the old walls I used to test against, but it should show up sharpness levels and chromatic aberration a bit better. Just for your interest, here's what the test chart looks like when shot with a perfectly sharp lens, the Samyang 135mm f2. As you can see, with a very sharp lens, you can see contrast and sharpness levels very well from the middle of the image and into the corners. I hope you'll find this new test chart helpful. Now for the Sigma 24-35. On a full frame camera and at 24mm and with the aperture wide open in the middle of the image, we see great sharpness and contrast with quite neutral colours. Let's look in the corners of the image. They look a lot darker due to vignetting, but we do continue to see very impressive sharpness, with just a hint of purple and green chromatic aberration. Really, that's excellent picture quality though for such an obviously difficult lens to design. Stop down to f2.8 for a little more brightness and sharpness, and at f4 we see good corner brightness and excellent sharpness and contrast. A very good show. Now let's see about things at 35mm. At f2, we continue to see very good sharpness in the middle of the image, but with a touch less bite than at 24mm. The corners continue to be quite dark at f2 with a touch of softness, but less colour fringing than 24mm. Stop the lens down to f2.8 for a very nice improvement in sharpness and brightness, and from f4, a brilliant image is shown. So on a full frame camera, the lens performs excellently, although stopping down to f2.8 or f4 yields a few rewards. Now, as I already mentioned, if you own an APS-C camera, then you might as well get hold of Sigma's 18-35mm f1.8 lens instead of this. But if you absolutely have to use the 24-35 on an APS-C camera, then the differences in image quality are what you might expect. The lens continues to be sharp at 24mm, you'll see far less vignetting in the corners, but a bit more chromatic aberration, of a slight magenta colour. At 35mm and f2, the image quality will be a touch softer, but massively improves as soon as you stop down. Anyway, let's move on and look at distortion and vignetting on a full-frame camera. At 24mm we see some noticeable barrel distortion. I was hoping for a little less from a lens with such a narrow zoom range, but admittedly it's not too bad. At f2 we see strong vignetting in the corners. Stop down to f2.8 to push that vignetting into the edges, and at f4 it's finally gone. Zoom in to 35mm and the lens projects a negligible level of pincushion distortion, nothing to worry about really. At f2 that vignetting is still pretty monstrous. Again at f2.8 it's pushed into the edges, and at f4 it's finally gone. Let's see about close-up picture quality. The lens can focus as closely as 28cm, about average for such a wide-angle lens. At f2, the close-up picture quality is a touch soft, getting sharper at f2.8 and very sharp from f4, so a slightly average performance there. Now let's see about the lens's work against bright lights. Even when pointed at the sun, zoomed in or out, the lens displays only very minimal flaring. That's a nice achievement for Sigma, I think. Finally, bokeh. The lens can give you nicely out of focus backgrounds, and it generally renders those backgrounds very well, even at 24mm, although sometimes points of light can get a little bit edgy. Overall, considering that this lens is a bit of a trailblazer in its design, its optical flaws can be forgiven, and we can say that its performance is great. It's certainly a very sharp piece of kit that easily rivals any fast, wide-angle prime lens out there. My biggest reservation about the lens is its huge size and weight, which I really don't appreciate. But then again, I'm a bit more of a landscape photographer who likes to have a nice light, image-stabilised lens to wander around the Welsh countryside with. I reckon that a lot of jobbing professionals, especially wedding photographers, will be falling over themselves to get a hold of this classy, fun lens, and so it certainly comes recommended.